So this is lesson 1.7, and it's entitled A Response to Modernity. So, really what this lesson will encompass is, what are the modern views of religion? So my first question is, well, what is this concept of modernity? What is it really about? So I want you to envision a farmer, an 18th century farmer. So this farmer will probably live his entire life within a few kilometers of where he was born. He will probably work there his entire life and die there. He will likely only have a small group of acquaintances, not super, concerned about, finding fulfillment in work or just general happiness. He's just sort of existing and doesn't have any ideologies about progressing to something greater in his life. For instance, he's aware of maybe a king. This is King Louis. If this farmer were in France, this would be his king. He's not concerned about, maybe working so hard in his life that he can progress to a point where he might, raise to some sort of position of nobility. That was incredibly unlikely. And, if he lived in the world at that time, if he was living, let's say, in France somewhere, then the likelihood of him, like I said, going anywhere outside of his very close vicinity was super unlikely. So, so how does this relate to the modern world? Well, as the world progressed, as science evolved, we were able to accomplish certain things and society's viewpoints changed. So, for example, you may recognize this person. This is a high school picture of Meghan Markle, who grew up in sort of an everyday city U.S., and due to, the world today and the way that it is, grew up to marry a prince. A modern day prince, Prince Harry, right? And why could that happen? Well, largely it was a function of our global society, right? And that itself has its foundation in scientific advances, so that people can communicate with others in the world, they can travel to different parts of the world. We don't exist within a few kilometers of where we live because we have access to scientific technologies that allow us to explore far beyond the reaches of our own town. So let's come up with a definition for modernity. So it comes from Latin. A lot of things come from Latin, from the term modernus, which means just now, right? We think of the modern world as being, well, what is the most recent interpretation of our world? Right? So it implies that there was some new thoughts, some new ways of thinking. Why did that modern era come to be? It came to be because all of a sudden science started being able to answer questions about the world that the church simply couldn't. People weren't satisfied with some of the explanations that the church had, and science seemed to come up with better ones. So what happened as a result of this in terms of religion? Well, there came to be the rise of 5 religious movements. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. So first of all, as I mentioned, different worldly events, namely science, brought about some questions about religion, and that evolved into some different movements, religious movements. The first would be agnosticism. We're going to talk about all of these in the next few slides. Atheism, fundamentalism, human secularism, and finally liberalism. So I want you to just take a ponder at that list and think, well, which of these ideas am I sort of familiar with, have I heard of before, and maybe know a little bit about? And hopefully as we go through the next few slides, you'll come to see, well, was there anything surprising to me, new, or interesting in these ideas? So let's start with agnosticism. So agnosticism really, again, comes from, it has its roots in the Greek language. So any word with an A before it, think like atypical, means without. And in this case, gnosis means knowledge. So if we put those pieces together, agnostic meaning without knowledge. So somebody who's agnostic or considers himself to be agnostic is is they would say that their understanding of God is that they don't know whether there is a God or not, or even if we can really know that. So it's not that they don't believe in God as much as there's no real proof of God. I don't know whether one exists. So really it's a term that describes somebody who is uncertain about the existence of a God or more than one God. So they kind of just don't really know, right? They're like, I don't know. As opposed to somebody who would consider themselves to be an atheist. So an atheist, we say that A in front, meaning not, and theist, meaning like theology or God. So an atheist is somebody who believes that there is no God. Now notice that's a positive statement, right? Like they're saying there is no God, as opposed to I don't really know. So some people will refer this as a religion because their lack of beliefs is actually a belief system in and of itself, if you can believe that. Many interfaith groups will actually include atheists. So remember, inter meaning between faiths. So groups that have many different faiths that are included in them may include atheists, right? Maybe that particular interfaith group attracts atheists because there's some sort of moral compass involved, or a set of ethics or guidelines. So an atheist overall will believe that there is no God. That is their belief system. Now, a fundamentalist, we've already, we did our section on cults. You'll remember that there was one fundamentalist group of Mormons that were discussed. So starting with that, you probably have an idea about what fundamentalism involves. And, if you belong to a fundamentalist sect or group, then you will have strict adherence or strict following of a particular set of rules or ideas. So you can sort of think of it as their text, right? So like their Bible-like text or book is taken literally and obeyed in full. So there's no individual interpretation whatsoever of the text. It's taken very literally. And that's very different than the Catholic way of being in that we tend to look at our sacred text, the Bible, the New and Old Testament contextually, which means we sort of read between the lines and interpret what the intention is behind the text as opposed to taking it literally. So aside from the fundamentalist Mormon groups, another group you might have seen if you travel to larger centers are fundamentalist Jews. And, they can be identified potentially by their unique way of dressing, and they have strict adherence to their particular sacred text without interpretation. So next we have human secularism. Human secularists believe that it is possible for human beings to exercise ethical and moral ideologies without religion or belief in a God. So in other words, it's kind of like I'm going to be a good person, not because God is telling me to be, but because it's just right. I don't need there to be a God guiding me to do that. I am human. I can develop my own rules around what is moral and what is good. So, this is where when we think about the farmer that I introduced at the beginning of this lesson, that farmer wouldn't really have been, particularly concerned with self-fulfillment or happiness. He probably would have seen his role as just sort of existing and following God's rules and laws. The human secularist would be more concerned with finding meaning in his or her life, trying to exercise a set of values and become, self-fulfilled, and come to terms with their sense of identity. That is a very modern concept. They don't really believe in blind faith. They typically don't associate with religions, and tend to be focused more on discovering their sense of self or their personal truth through science and philosophical discussions. Now, lastly, we've got liberalism. And so liberalism is a little bit tricky because it's sort of like in between human secularism and just religious belief, I guess. In that, you know, when you're a liberalist, you might still belong to a particular religion or faith group, but you're less concerned about the scripture and the laws that religion holds to be true. So, for instance, if we were talking about a particular religion where going to church on Sundays and maybe not eating pork, you know, maybe that would be something that you would be less concerned about because that would be a scripture or a law. But you might still hold the basic values and ethics and morals of that religion true. And so you would be more concerned about, internal motivation, just sort of being a good person, being a spiritual person, but less concerned about, you know, maybe following rules. So people, these individuals might, for instance, hold near and dear social justice issues, human rights issues, and so on and so forth, while still belonging to a particular faith, though relying less on the rules and regulations of that particular religion. So at this point, I want to stop and just sort of compare a few of the terms we just looked at. So first, human secularism, atheism, and agnosticism. And I want to compare them really because those are the ones that are typically compared. So if you had to kind of describe for yourself, what are the differences between these? Fundamentally, I mean, there are a lot of differences, but at the basic root of it all, what are the differences? What would you say? So I would pause the video, maybe give this a go, and then resume when you're ready to kind of think about the ideas that you put out. So first of all, a human secularist would say that God is not necessary to be moral. They're not really concerned about whether there is a God or not a God. They're just saying that God is not really necessary for me to live a moral and ethical life. Whereas an atheist would just be rejecting the idea of God entirely. There is no God. And if we're talking about an agnostic person, they're really not really believing or disbelieving in a God or religious doctrine at all. They're kind of just take the stance that humans don't really know, maybe for certain what caused the universe to be created, or whether gods do or do not exist. That is not their concern. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the main ideas in this lesson. There are a few activities that I want you to follow up with in the activity document, but certainly reach out if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to chat more about these ideas.